In the unforgiving world of military service, where strength is measured in push-ups and resilience tested under fire, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had learned to live with whispers that followed her everywhere she went. The intricate pattern of scars that decorated her arms and hands told a story that most people would never understand, a story that began not on a battlefield, but in a burning apartment building when she was just 17 years old. Every morning as she laced up her combat boots, Maria could feel the curious stares of her fellow Marines. Some looked with pity, others with barely concealed disgust. The newer recruits would nudge each other and whisper behind cupped hands, making up their own versions of how she got those marks. Drug addiction, they speculated. Self-harm, others suggested. Gang violence, the boldest among them declared with false confidence. But what none of them knew, what Maria had never told anyone in her 8 years of service, was that these scars were not marks of weakness or poor choices. They were medals of honor earned in civilian clothes, badges of courage that predated her military service by years. Each raised line on her skin represented a life saved, a moment when a teenage girl chose to run into danger instead of away from it. Today, everything would change. Today, a visiting general would notice those same scars that had made her the subject of cruel jokes and hushed conversations. And, when he did, the silence that would follow would be so profound, so heavy with unspoken respect, that even the most hardened Marines would understand they had been in the presence of a hero all along, they just hadn't known how to recognize her. The morning inspection began like any other Tuesday at Camp Pendleton. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood at attention in formation, her uniform crisp and spotless, her posture perfect after 8 years of military discipline. But, as Captain Rodriguez walked down the line of Marines, she could feel the familiar weight of judgment settling over her like a heavy blanket. The scars on her hands and forearms were impossible to hide completely, despite her best efforts to position her sleeves and gloves strategically. The raised tissue caught the California sun, creating shadows that seemed to tell stories in a language only she could understand. To her fellow Marines, those stories were written in a script they assumed they could read, tales of weakness, poor choices, and a past better left unexamined. Private Johnson, barely 19 and fresh from boot camp, couldn't help but steal glances at Maria's arms during the inspection. He had heard the rumors whispered in the barracks late at night. Some said she was a former addict who had burned herself with cigarettes. Others claimed she had been in a gang and the scars were from fights. The most creative storytellers insisted she had tried to take her own life multiple times before joining the Marines as a last resort. None of them had ever asked her directly. In the military, you learned quickly that some questions were off limits, and Maria Santos had built a wall around her past that seemed impenetrable. She answered when spoken to, completed her duties with exceptional skill, and maintained the kind of professional distance that discouraged personal inquiries. But the speculation never stopped. During weapons training that afternoon, Corporal Martinez made the mistake of cracking a joke loud enough for half the unit to hear. "Hey Santos, did you get those decorations in a knife fight or a kitchen fire?" The nervous laughter that followed was the kind that happens when people are uncomfortable but don't know how else to react. Maria's response was the same as always, a steady look that could freeze blood in veins, followed by complete silence. She had perfected this reaction over years of similar comments. It was more effective than anger, more powerful than explanation. It shut down conversations before they could really begin. "That's enough, Martinez," Sergeant First Class Williams intervened, but the damage was already done. The comment hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere and reminding everyone present that Maria Santos was different, marked, somehow less than the rest of them. What they didn't know was that Maria had heard every variation of these jokes hundreds of times. In her first year of service, they had stung like fresh wounds. By her third year, they had become background noise, as predictable as the morning bugle call. Now, in her 8th year, they were simply part of the landscape of her military life, unwelcome but familiar, like an old injury that ached when the weather changed. The truth was that Maria had learned to live with two kinds of scars. The visible ones on her skin told a story of heroism that she had never shared with anyone in uniform. The invisible ones on her spirit told a story of isolation and judgment that grew deeper with each passing day. After the training session ended, Maria found herself alone in the equipment storage room, methodically cleaning and organizing gear that didn't really need attention. It was her way of finding peace in a world that seemed determined to remind her that she didn't quite fit. The repetitive motions of her hands, the same hands that carried those mysterious scars, brought her a kind of meditation. She thought about her family back in Los Angeles, who had stopped asking when she would visit home for holidays. She thought about her younger sister Carmen, who had graduated from nursing school the month before and sent pictures that Maria kept hidden in her footlocker. She thought about her mother, who still lit a candle every Sunday at church and prayed for her eldest daughter to find peace. Most of all, she thought about the night that had changed everything, the night that had given her these scars and set her on the path that led to this storage room, this base, this life of service that had become both her salvation and her prison. The memory came back in fragments, as it always did. The smell of smoke. The sound of screaming. The feeling of heat against her face as she made decision after decision that would mark her forever. The weight of small bodies in her arms. The grateful tears of parents who would never know her name but would remember her face for the rest of their lives. She had been 17 then, just a kid herself working a part-time job at a downtown apartment complex. The night janitor position paid minimum wage and required her to work alone, but it helped her family with bills and gave her time to study between rounds. She had been planning to use the money for college, maybe study business or education. She had dreams then, simple ones that seemed achievable with enough hard work and determination. Those dreams had changed in the span of 30 minutes on a Thursday night in March. By the time the fire department arrived, Maria had already carried 6 children and 2 elderly residents out of the burning building. By the time the paramedics finished treating her burns, she had already decided that her life would be dedicated to protecting others, no matter the cost to herself. The Marines had seemed like the logical next step. Service to country, protection of the innocent, dedication to something larger than herself, all concepts that resonated with the young woman who had learned what it meant to put others before her own safety. She had excelled in boot camp, graduated with honors from her military occupational specialty training, and built a reputation as a reliable, competent Marine who could be counted on in any situation. But she had never told anyone about the fire. She had never explained the true origin of her scars. She had never shared the newspaper clippings that her mother had saved, the ones with headlines like "Teenage Hero Saves 7 from Apartment Fire" and "Local Girl Risks Life to Rescue Neighbors." Those articles were locked away in her footlocker, along with the letters of thanks from family she had helped save and the commendation from the city fire department. In the military, she had learned, heroism was measured in different terms. Combat actions, successful missions, leadership under fire, these were the currencies of respect in her world. Civilian heroism, especially the kind that happened before enlistment, seemed somehow less important, less valid. So she had kept her story to herself and let her fellow Marines draw their own conclusions about the marks that covered her skin. As the sun began to set over the base, Maria finished her work in the storage room and prepared to return to the barracks. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and assumptions, another day of proving herself worthy despite the visible reminders of her past. She had become an expert at this dance of competence and silence, performance and privacy. She didn't know that tomorrow would also bring a visitor to their base, a general whose own history with fire and rescue would give him the ability to read the true story written in the scars that others saw only as marks of shame. She didn't know that the silence she had maintained for 8 years was about to be broken by someone who understood the language of sacrifice in all its forms. As she walked across the base in the fading light, Maria Santos carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of judgment and isolation. She had learned to find strength in solitude, purpose in service, and meaning in the knowledge that she had done the right thing when it mattered most. But she had also learned to live with loneliness, and that lesson was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. The announcement came during the Thursday morning briefing, delivered by Colonel Harrison with the kind of crisp efficiency that made junior Marines stand a little straighter. General Patricia Caldwell would be visiting Camp Pendleton for a comprehensive unit inspection and readiness assessment. She was a decorated combat veteran, a Bronze Star recipient, and one of the highest-ranking women in the Marine Corps. "I want this base running like a Swiss watch," Colonel Harrison declared, his eyes scanning the assembled unit leaders. "General Caldwell has a reputation for noticing details that others miss, and she doesn't suffer fools gladly. Every Marine, every piece of equipment, every procedure needs to be flawless. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos listened with the same focused attention she brought to all briefings, but her mind was already calculating the logistics. High-level visits meant increased scrutiny, longer inspections, and more opportunities for the kind of uncomfortable attention she had spent years learning to avoid. Generals had a way of asking probing questions, and questions led to explanations that Maria wasn't prepared to give. The news spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By lunchtime, every Marine knew that General Caldwell was coming, and, by dinner, everyone had heard at least 3 different versions of her legendary reputation. Some stories focused on her tactical brilliance during operations in Afghanistan. Others highlighted her zero-tolerance policy for substandard performance. All of them agreed on one point: Patricia Caldwell was not someone you wanted to disappoint. Corporal Martinez, still smarting from his earlier reprimand about comments directed at Maria, saw the upcoming inspection as an opportunity to shift attention away from his own conduct. "Maybe the general will finally ask Santos about those scars," he muttered to Private Johnson during evening chow. "Someone with her rank might actually get a straight answer." Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The younger Marine had been thinking more about his comments regarding Maria's appearance, especially after witnessing her exceptional performance during the previous week's combat training exercise. She had outshot half the unit, completed the obstacle course in record time, and demonstrated tactical knowledge that impressed even the most experienced sergeants. The disconnect between her obvious competence and his assumptions about her past was becoming impossible to ignore. "Maybe we should mind our own business," Johnson suggested quietly. "Santos has never caused problems for anyone. She does her job better than most of us." Martinez shrugged, unwilling to abandon his speculation. "Still weird that she won't talk about it. In the Marines, you're supposed to trust your unit with your life. How can we trust someone who won't even explain how she got those marks?" The conversation was overheard by Sergeant Williams, who had been observing the dynamics within his unit with growing concern. Williams had 22 years of service under his belt and had learned to recognize the signs of a cohesion problem before it became a discipline issue. The persistent focus on Maria's appearance was creating exactly the kind of divisive atmosphere that could undermine unit effectiveness. That evening, Williams approached Maria as she completed her final equipment check of the day. She was alone, as usual, methodically ensuring that every piece of gear was properly maintained and accounted for. Her attention to detail was one of the things that made her an exceptional Marine, but Williams couldn't help noticing that her solitary work habits also served to minimize her interaction with other unit members. "Santos, a word," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Maria straightened immediately, giving him her full attention. "Yes, Sergeant." Williams studied her face, noting the wariness that always seemed to lurk behind her professional composure. In all his years of service, he had rarely encountered a Marine who was so competent yet so guarded, so clearly committed to the Corps yet so isolated from her fellow Marines. "General Caldwell's visit has everyone on edge," he began carefully. "I need to know if there's anything about your background that might come up during her inspection. Anything that could reflect poorly on the unit." The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone probed too close to her carefully guarded history. She had perfected the art of deflection over the years, but something in Williams' expression suggested that simple evasion might not be sufficient this time. "My record is clean, Sergeant," she replied evenly. "No disciplinary actions, no criminal history, no issues with security clearance. I've never given this unit cause for concern." Williams nodded slowly. Everything she said was true. He had reviewed her file multiple times and found nothing but exemplary performance evaluations and commendations. But he also knew that sometimes the most important parts of a person's story weren't captured in official documentation. "I'm not questioning your service record, Santos. But I am concerned about unit cohesion. The speculation about your scars is affecting morale, and it's going to be hard to maintain the kind of tight-knit unit that General Caldwell expects to see." Maria felt her jaw tighten involuntarily. 8 years of keeping her personal history private, 8 years of focusing on her job and letting her performance speak for itself, and it still came back to the marks on her skin that she couldn't hide and wouldn't explain.
Permission to speak freely, Sergeant? Williams nodded. I've never asked for special treatment, and I've never let personal matters interfere with my duties. If the unit has cohesion problems, maybe the issue isn't my privacy. Maybe it's the fact that some Marines can't focus on their jobs when they're too busy making up stories about their fellow service members. The response was delivered with perfect military courtesy, but Williams could hear the steel beneath the words. Maria Santos had clearly given this speech before, probably to herself if not to others. She had thought through every angle of this situation and arrived at a position she was prepared to defend. Williams found himself in an impossible position. As a senior non-commissioned officer, he needed to maintain unit cohesion and prepare for a high-stakes inspection. But he also recognized that Maria was right. She had never done anything to warrant the kind of persistent scrutiny she faced. Her only crime was looking different and refusing to satisfy the curiosity of Marines who should have been focusing on their own responsibilities. Understood, he said finally. But, Santos, if there's anything in your background that you think might come up during the general's visit, now would be the time to give me a heads up. I'm not asking you to share personal information. I'm asking you to help me protect this unit from any surprises that might affect our readiness evaluation. Maria considered his words carefully. Sergeant Williams had always been fair in his dealings with her, more professional than personal but never hostile. If she was going to trust anyone with even a partial explanation, he might be the safest choice. But years of reflexive secrecy made the prospect of disclosure feel almost physically painful. There won't be any surprises, Sergeant, she said at last. My background is exactly what it appears to be in my service record. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. Her service record did contain the basic facts of her civilian life before enlistment, high school graduation, part-time employment, clean legal history. What it didn't contain were the details that had shaped her decision to join the Marines in the first place. Williams accepted her answer with a nod, but Maria could see that he wasn't entirely satisfied. As she watched him walk away, she realized that the upcoming inspection represented more than just another hurdle in her military career. It was a potential reckoning with a past she had worked so hard to compartmentalize. That night, alone in her bunk while her roommate attended a movie in the recreation center, Maria allowed herself to think about the newspaper clippings hidden in her footlocker. She thought about the commendation letter from the Los Angeles Fire Department that praised her extraordinary courage and selfless dedication to preserving human life. She thought about the thank you cards from families whose children she had carried to safety through smoke and flame. She also thought about the months of physical therapy that had followed, the painful process of learning to use her hands again as the burned tissue healed and scarred. She remembered the doctors who had told her that the scars would fade but never completely disappear, and her own decision that visible reminders of that night weren't necessarily a bad thing. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she had decided to turn down the college scholarship offered by a grateful community and enlist in the Marines instead. The fire had shown her that she was capable of extraordinary things when ordinary people needed help. The Marines offered a chance to make that capability the center of her life. But, somewhere along the way, the very thing that had made her a hero in civilian life had become a source of shame and suspicion in her military career. The scars that had once been symbols of her courage had been transformed into objects of gossip and speculation. The story that should have made her fellow Marines proud to serve alongside her had become a secret she felt compelled to protect. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria Santos wondered if General Caldwell's visit might force her to finally bridge the gap between the person she had been and the Marine she had become. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly liberating. After 8 years of silence, part of her was almost ready to let someone else carry the weight of her truth. General Patricia Caldwell stepped out of the black sedan with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention from every Marine within sight. She was smaller in stature than many had expected, but there was an energy about her that seemed to fill the space around her, an aura of competence and authority earned through decades of service in some of the most challenging environments the military had to offer. Colonel Harrison and his senior staff formed a receiving line at the entrance to the administrative building, their uniforms pressed to perfection and their postures rigid with nervous energy. The general's reputation for thorough inspections had preceded her,
And everyone knew that the next few hours would determine how their unit was perceived by the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. Maria Santos watched the arrival from her position in the motor pool, where she was conducting the final maintenance checks on the vehicles that would be part of the afternoon's operational demonstration. She had volunteered for the assignment partly because it allowed her to contribute meaningfully to the inspection preparation, but mostly because it kept her away from the initial meet and greet activities where her appearance might draw unwanted attention. The general moved through the base with systematic efficiency, examining equipment, reviewing procedures, and asking probing questions that revealed an impressive depth of knowledge about logistics, tactics, and personnel management. She spent considerable time in the armory, discussing weapons maintenance protocols with the unit's armorers. She reviewed training records in detail, noting commendations and identifying areas for improvement. But what struck many of the Marines who interacted with her was her ability to remember names and faces after single introductions. General Caldwell had clearly done her homework, studying personnel files and unit histories before arriving. She knew which Marines had recently returned from deployment, which ones were approaching re-enlistment decisions, and which ones had shown particular promise for advancement. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout the base that the general's inspection was proceeding smoothly. There had been no major discrepancies, no embarrassing discoveries, and no evidence of the kind of systemic problems that could derail a unit's readiness rating. Colonel Harrison began to relax slightly, allowing himself to hope that his command might emerge from this evaluation with its reputation enhanced. The afternoon brought operational demonstrations, including a simulated combat scenario that showcased the unit's tactical capabilities and coordination. Maria found herself assigned to the communications team, responsible for maintaining contact between different elements of the exercise. It was a role that highlighted her technical expertise while keeping her in the background of the action. The simulation went flawlessly. Radio communications remained clear and timely, equipment functioned without problems, and the Marines executed their assigned tasks with precision. General Caldwell observed from an elevated position that gave her a clear view of the entire exercise area, occasionally making notes on a tablet that Colonel Harrison eyed nervously. As the exercise concluded and equipment was being collected, the general approached the communications station where Maria was performing post-operation checks on the radio equipment. It was the first time they had been in close proximity, and Maria felt her pulse quicken as the senior officer drew near. "Staff Sergeant Santos, correct?" General Caldwell's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of being listened to, but there was also a warmth in her tone that Maria hadn't expected. "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied, snapping to attention with practiced precision. The general studied her face for a moment, then let her gaze drift to Maria's hands as they moved efficiently across the radio controls. Even with her sleeves properly positioned and her gloves in place, some of the scar tissue was visible on her wrists and the backs of her hands. But, instead of the curious or judgmental look that Maria had learned to expect, the general's expression was thoughtful, almost contemplative. "You handled communications excellently during the exercise," General Caldwell observed. "Clean transmissions, proper protocols, no delays or confusion." "How long have you been working with radio systems?" 7 years, ma'am, since completing my military occupational specialty training after boot camp." Maria's response was crisp and professional, the kind of answer that provided information without inviting follow-up questions. "And before the Marines? Any experience with emergency communications?" The question caught Maria off guard. It was specific enough to suggest that the general might know more about her background than the typical inspection would reveal, but vague enough that it could have been simple conversation. Maria felt the familiar tension that came whenever someone probed too close to her civilian history. "Some experience with emergency procedures, ma'am, but nothing formal." It was technically accurate, she had indeed gained familiarity with emergency communications during the apartment fire, coordinating with first responders and helping to direct rescue efforts. But that experience had been born of necessity rather than training. General Caldwell nodded thoughtfully, her eyes returning to Maria's hands. There was something in her expression that suggested recognition, but she didn't pursue the topic further. Instead, she asked about the technical specifications of the radio equipment, the unit's communication protocols, and Maria's assessment of the system's reliability under field conditions. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt much longer to Maria. Throughout the exchange, she had the unsettling sensation that the general was evaluating more than just her technical knowledge. There was an intensity to the senior officer's attention that suggested she was looking for something specific, some piece of information that would complete a puzzle she was working to solve. When General Caldwell finally moved on to inspect other aspects of the operation, Maria felt both relieved and, oddly, disappointed. The interaction had been professional and positive, but it had also stirred emotions that she usually kept carefully controlled. For a brief moment, she had wondered what it might be like to serve under a commander who looked at her scars with understanding rather than suspicion. The rest of the inspection proceeded without incident. General Caldwell met with individual Marines throughout the unit, reviewed administrative procedures, and conducted a final briefing with Colonel Harrison and his senior staff. By late afternoon, it was clear that the unit had performed exceptionally well and that the general's evaluation would be overwhelmingly positive. But, as the day wore on, Maria noticed that General Caldwell seemed to be looking for her. Not obviously, not in a way that would attract attention from others, but with the kind of persistent interest that suggested unfinished business. During the equipment inventory, the general appeared at stations where Maria was working. During the administrative review, she asked casual questions about personnel assignments that seemed designed to elicit information about Maria's role and responsibilities. The attention made Maria increasingly uncomfortable. She had spent 8 years perfecting the art of avoiding scrutiny, and the general's interest threatened to upset the delicate balance she had constructed between her public service and her private history. Every look, every casual question, felt like a step closer to revelations that she wasn't prepared to make. As the official inspection activities concluded and the base began to return to normal operations, Maria thought she might have escaped serious examination. But, as she was securing the last of the communications equipment, General Caldwell approached her one final time.
"Staff Sergeant Santos, I'd like you to accompany me to Colonel Harrison's office. There are some matters I'd like to discuss with you both."
The request was phrased politely, but Maria recognized an order when she heard one. Her stomach tightened as she realized that whatever the general had been looking for all day, she had apparently found it. The moment Maria had been dreading for 8 years, the moment when her carefully maintained privacy would finally be challenged by someone with the authority to demand answers, had arrived.
As they walked across the base toward the administrative building, Maria tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming.
She had always known that this day might arrive, that her past might eventually intersect with her present in ways she couldn't control. She had hoped it would happen later in her career, when she had achieved enough rank and respect to weather whatever storm might follow. But General Caldwell's interest seemed different from the idle curiosity or cruel speculation she had encountered from other Marines. There was purpose in the senior officer's attention, a sense that she was working toward some specific objective rather than simply satisfying personal curiosity. As they reached the administrative building, Maria realized that the next few minutes would likely determine the trajectory of her entire military career. 8 years of silence was about to be tested against the persistent inquiry of one of the most senior officers in the Corps. The only question that remained was whether the truth, when it finally emerged, would destroy everything she had worked to build, or whether it might finally provide the foundation for the kind of respect and acceptance she had always hoped to earn. The walk to Colonel Harrison's office felt like the longest march of Maria's military career. Each step echoed off the polished floors of the administrative building, creating a rhythm that seemed to count down to an inevitable moment of reckoning. General Caldwell walked beside her in comfortable silence, but Maria could sense the weight of purpose in the senior officer's demeanor. Colonel Harrison was waiting in his office, his expression betraying the same nervous energy that had characterized the entire inspection day. When General Caldwell and Maria entered, he immediately stood and gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of his desk.
The formal setup suggested that this was more than a casual conversation, it was an official meeting with implications that Maria couldn't yet fathom.
"Please, both of you, have a seat," General Caldwell said, taking the lead in a way that made it clear this was her meeting despite being in Colonel Harrison's office. She settled into her chair with the kind of composed confidence that came from decades of difficult conversations and hard decisions. Maria remained at attention until specifically told to sit, her training taking over in a situation where she had no other guidance to follow. Her hands, positioned carefully on her knees, felt like they were burning under the fabric of her uniform. Every scar seemed to pulse with awareness, as if the marks themselves knew they were about to become the center of attention. General Caldwell began by reviewing the highlights of the day's inspection, praising the unit's performance and noting specific areas where the Marines had exceeded her expectations. Her comments were genuine and detailed, demonstrating that she had paid careful attention to every aspect of the evaluation. Colonel Harrison visibly relaxed as the positive assessment continued. But, then, the general's tone shifted slightly, becoming more focused and personal. "Colonel Harrison, I'd like to discuss Staff Sergeant Santos specifically. Her performance today was exceptional, but I'm more interested in her background and how she came to serve in your unit." Maria felt her mouth go dry. This was the moment she had been dreading, the point where her carefully maintained privacy would collide with official inquiry. She had always known that her past might eventually catch up with her, but she had hoped it would be on her own terms, at a time of her choosing. Colonel Harrison consulted the file he had prepared for the meeting. "Santos has been with us for 3 years, General. Excellent service record, no disciplinary issues, consistently high performance evaluations. She's one of our most reliable Marines." "I'm sure she is," General Caldwell replied. "But I'm curious about her background before joining the Marines. Specifically, what she was doing in Los Angeles in March of 2005. The specific date hit Maria like a physical blow. March 2005 was when the fire had happened, when her life had changed forever. There was no way the general could know the date unless she had done extensive research into Maria's civilian background. But why would a senior officer invest that kind of time and effort into investigating a staff sergeant? Colonel Harrison looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand the relevance, General. Santos' background check was clean when she enlisted. There's nothing in her file that would suggest." General Caldwell held up a hand to stop him. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm going to tell you what I know, and then I'd like you to fill in the details. On the evening of March 15, 2005, there was a fire at the Esperanza Apartments in downtown Los Angeles. A 17-year-old girl working as a night janitor discovered the fire and spent the next 30 minutes evacuating residents from the building. She saved 7 lives that night, including 4 children and 2 elderly residents who would not have survived without her intervention." Maria's carefully maintained composure began to crack. The clinical recitation of facts she had never shared with anyone in the military felt surreal, as if someone else's life was being described. But the details were too specific, too accurate to be anything other than the result of thorough investigation. "The girl suffered significant burns to her hands and arms during the rescue operations," the general continued. "She was hospitalized for a weekend, required months of physical therapy. The Los Angeles Fire Department recommended her for a Civilian Heroism Award, and the mayor presented her with a key to the city. Her name was Maria Elena Santos." The silence that followed was so complete that Maria could hear the air conditioning cycling in the office ventilation system. Colonel Harrison stared at her with an expression that mixed shock, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. All the pieces of the puzzle, the scars, the isolation, the exceptional competence, suddenly arranged themselves into a picture that made perfect sense. "General," Maria managed to say, her voice steadier than she had expected it to be, "permission to ask how you came by this information?" General Caldwell smiled for the first time since entering the office. "Because 18 years ago, I was a young lieutenant serving as a liaison with the Los Angeles Fire Department. I was present when they briefed our unit about civilian emergency response procedures, and your rescue was used as a case study in courage under pressure. I've never forgotten that story, and when I saw your name on the unit roster, I wondered if it could be the same person." She paused, studying Maria's face with new understanding. "When I saw your scars today, I knew for certain. Those marks aren't random, they're the specific pattern you'd get from repeatedly reaching through flames to grab people. I recognized them because I've seen similar injuries on firefighters and rescue personnel." Colonel Harrison was still processing the revelation. "Santos, why didn't you ever mention this? This is exactly the kind of background we want to highlight. A hero before you even put on the uniform." The question hung in the air, and Maria realized that 8 years of silence had led to this moment when she would finally have to explain not just what happened, but why she had chosen to keep it secret. The reason seemed almost foolish now, in the presence of a general who clearly understood the value of civilian heroism. "Sir, I wasn't sure it was relevant to military service. The incident happened before I enlisted, and I thought my performance as a Marine should speak for itself." The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears, but it was the closest she could come to articulating the complex emotions that had driven her decision. General Caldwell leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "Staff Sergeant Santos, let me be very clear about something. The courage you demonstrated that night running into a burning building repeatedly to save strangers is exactly the kind of character we want in the Marine Corps. It's not separate from your military service, it's the foundation of it." She stood and began pacing, a habit that suggested she was working through important thoughts. "Do you know what I see when I look at your scars? I see proof that you were willing to sacrifice your own safety for others before you had any training, any obligation, any reason other than basic human decency. That's not common, Santos. That's extraordinary." Maria felt tears threatening for the first time in years. The validation she had never thought to seek, the recognition she had convinced herself didn't matter, was being offered by one of the most senior officers in the Corps. It was overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. Colonel Harrison was beginning to understand the broader implications. "General, are you suggesting that Santos has been underutilized in her current role?" "I'm suggesting that we have a Marine whose natural instincts for life-saving and emergency response have never been properly developed or recognized. Santos, have you ever considered specialized training in search and rescue operations?" The question opened possibilities that Maria had never allowed herself to contemplate. Search and rescue would mean using her instincts for helping others in an official capacity, with proper training and equipment. It would mean turning the nightmare of that March evening into the foundation for a career dedicated to saving lives. "I hadn't considered it, ma'am," she admitted. "But it sounds like something I'd be interested in pursuing." General Caldwell nodded approvingly. "Good. Because I'm recommending you for the Advanced Combat Rescue School at Kirtland Air Force Base. It's an intense program, but I think you have exactly the right combination of instincts, experience, and dedication to excel." As the meeting concluded and plans were made for Maria's new training assignment, she realized that the scars she had hidden for so long were about to become the credentials for a new phase of her career. The marks that had made her an object of speculation and judgment were finally being recognized for what they truly represented: evidence of courage, dedication, and an unshakable commitment to preserving human life. For the first time in 8 years, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was about to discover what it felt like to be completely understood by the people she served alongside. News traveled fast on a military base, but the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos spread with unprecedented speed. Within hours of General Caldwell's departure, every Marine at Camp Pendleton knew about the apartment fire, the 7 lives saved, and the scars that told a story of heroism rather than shame. The transformation in how Maria was perceived was so immediate and complete that it seemed to change the very atmosphere of the base. Corporal Martinez, who had made cruel jokes about Maria's appearance just days earlier, found himself unable to look her in the eye during the next morning's formation. The weight of his previous comments felt crushing now that he understood the true origin of the marks he had mocked. He had spent the previous evening lying awake, replaying every thoughtless joke and realizing how profoundly he had misjudged someone who deserved nothing but respect. Private Johnson approached Maria after the formation, his young face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been awe. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I wanted to apologize for all the times I stared, or wondered, or listened to people say stupid things without speaking up. I had no idea." Maria studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and the kind of humility that came from recognizing a significant personal failing. She had spent years hardening herself against the curiosity and judgment of her fellow Marines, but their newfound understanding brought with it an unexpected challenge: learning how to accept the respect and admiration she had always deserved. "Johnson, you're young, and you had incomplete information. The important thing is what you do with complete information." Her response was measured and professional, but there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. The burden of carrying her secret alone had been lifted, and, with it, some of the defensive walls she had built around herself. Sergeant Williams, who had tried unsuccessfully to bridge the gap between Maria and her unit, felt a mixture of relief and regret as he watched the dynamics shift around her. Relief that the mystery had been solved in a way that enhanced rather than damaged her reputation. Regret that it had taken intervention from a general to accomplish what should have been achieved through simple human decency and professional respect. The paperwork for Maria's transfer to Advanced Combat Rescue School was expedited with unusual efficiency. Colonel Harrison, still processing the revelation that one of his Marines was a decorated civilian hero, wanted to ensure that her new assignment reflected the full measure of her capabilities. The training would be intensive and challenging, but it would also position her for a career that aligned perfectly with her natural instincts and proven abilities. As Maria prepared for her departure from Camp Pendleton, she found herself experiencing emotions that had been dormant for years. The prospect of specialized training in search and rescue operations excited her in ways that routine military duties never had. For the first time since enlisting, she would be pursuing a role that directly connected to the moment that had defined her character and set her life's direction. The night before her departure, Maria sat in the barracks completing her final preparations. Her roommate, Lance Corporal Patricia Hayes, who had maintained respectful distance throughout their shared assignment, finally broke the silence that had characterized their relationship.
"Santos, can I ask you something?"
Hayes' voice was hesitant, as if she was unsure whether the new openness extended to personal conversations.
"Go ahead. Were you scared? That night in the fire, when you kept going back for people?" Maria considered the question carefully. It was the first time anyone had asked about her emotional experience rather than just the facts of what had happened. The memory came back with startling clarity: the heat, the smoke, the sound of crying children, and, yes, the fear that had threatened to overwhelm her with each trip into the burning building.
Terrified, she admitted.
"Every single time I went back in, I thought it might be the last thing I ever did."
But the fear wasn't stronger than the knowledge that people would die if I didn't try.
Hayes nodded slowly. "That's what makes it brave, isn't it? Doing it anyway, even when you're scared." The simple observation carried more weight than elaborate praise or official recognition.
It acknowledged not just what Maria had accomplished, but the cost at which it had been achieved. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act in spite of fear when action mattered most. The conversation opened a floodgate of similar interactions over the following weeks. Marines who had served alongside Maria for years suddenly felt free to approach her, to ask questions, to share their own stories of moments when they had been called upon to choose between safety and service. The scars that had once isolated her became a bridge connecting her to others who understood the weight of consequential decisions. The Advanced Combat Rescue School at Kirtland Air Force Base proved to be everything General Caldwell had promised and more. The training was physically demanding, technically complex, and emotionally challenging. Students learned to operate in hostile environments, to extract casualties from impossible situations, and to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. But, for Maria, the training felt like coming home. Every skill she mastered, every scenario she navigated, every life she learned to save connected directly to the 17-year-old girl who had run into a burning building because someone had to. The instructors quickly recognized her natural aptitude for rescue operations, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her intuitive understanding of how to prioritize when multiple lives hung in the balance. Captain Rebecca Martinez, the school's senior instructor, pulled Maria aside after a particularly challenging exercise involving a simulated building collapse. "Santos, I've been teaching this course for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone with your combination of technical skill and natural instinct. You don't just follow procedures, you understand why they exist and when to adapt them." The praise meant more to Maria than any commendation she had received in 8 years of regular military service. For the first time in her career, she was being evaluated by people who understood that saving lives required a specific set of qualities that couldn't be taught in a manual or measured on a standard evaluation. When she graduated from the program 6 months later, Maria had been selected for assignment to the Marine Corps' Elite Emergency Response Team, a specialized unit that deployed to disaster zones and combat areas where advanced rescue capabilities were needed. It was a role that would take her around the world, but it would also allow her to use her skills and experience in service of the mission that had defined her life since she was 17 years old. The Marines who had once speculated about her scars now spoke of her with the kind of pride reserved for unit heroes. Stories of her civilian rescue and her military training spread throughout the Corps, inspiring other Marines to pursue specialized training and to recognize that heroism could take many forms. General Caldwell, who had continued to monitor Maria's progress through the rescue training program, arranged to be present for her graduation ceremony. As she pinned the specialized qualification badge to Maria's uniform, she offered words that finally gave voice to 8 years of silent service. Staff Sergeant Santos, these scars have always told the story of a hero. Today, we're finally honoring that story properly. As Maria looked out at the assembled audience, fellow graduates, instructors, family members who had flown in for the ceremony, she realized that the journey from isolated Marine to recognized specialist had been about more than just career advancement. It had been about learning to integrate all the parts of herself into a coherent whole, to stop compartmentalizing her past and present, and to accept that her scars were not marks of shame to be hidden but evidence of character to be honored. The apartment fire had given her the scars and the conviction that would define her life. The Marine Corps had given her the discipline and skills to channel that conviction into professional service. The Advanced Combat Rescue School had given her the specialized training to excel at what she was naturally gifted to do. But, perhaps most importantly, General Caldwell's recognition had given her permission to stop hiding the very thing that made her exceptional. For the first time in 8 years, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was exactly who she was supposed to be, a Marine whose scars told the story of a hero, and whose future would be spent adding new chapters to that story every time someone needed to be saved. The ridiculing whispers had been replaced by respectful silence, and that silence had given way to admiration and recognition. The Marines who had once questioned her place among them now knew that she belonged not just in their ranks, but among their finest examples of what it meant to serve others at personal cost. As she prepared for her first assignment with the emergency response team, Maria carried with her not just the technical skills she had mastered and the qualifications she had earned, but the profound understanding that sometimes the most important moment in a person's life happens before they even know who they're meant to become. Her scars had finally found their proper place, not as sources of shame or mystery, but as credentials for a career spent doing exactly what she had always been meant to do, running toward danger when others needed help, regardless of the cost to herself.